I still remember the moment she said it, the words cutting through the quiet of my living room, like a blade I wasn't expecting. "Everything now belongs to me," she said, her voice steady, almost casual, as if she were announcing the weather rather than claiming my life's work. I sat there watching her smile with that smug confidence, the kind that makes you doubt your own eyes, your own mind. My son shifted uneasily beside her, avoiding my gaze, and the lawyer cleared his throat, nervous, unsure what to say. Everyone was waiting for me to react, to protest, to throw my hands in the air and shout that she had no right. But I didn't. I just nodded quietly and said nothing. It wasn't weakness, though I'm sure everyone thought it was. My wife had taught me patience, the kind of patience that waits for the storm to pass only to strike at the perfect moment. She had always said, "Observe first, react later. Never let anger guide your hand." And so I sat, letting her triumph, letting the tension settle around the room like dust in a forgotten attic. I could see it in her eyes, the certainty that she had won. She didn't notice the way I scanned the room, noting every reaction, every tiny flicker of doubt in my son's expression. I leaned back slightly in my chair, feeling the weight of decades press against me. 42 years in this house, building a life, a home, a legacy. And now, in the span of 1 hour, it seemed to be slipping through my fingers, taken for granted, claimed as though it were hers by right. I reminded myself to breathe, to stay calm. Let her think she had control. Let her believe she had finally outmaneuvered me. In a few moments, I would see how fragile her confidence really was. The room was silent, save for the ticking of the old clock on the mantel, each second punctuating the absurdity of the situation. I could feel the history of the house pressing in on me, the laughter of my wife, the first time my son ran through the hallway, the quiet evenings spent reading by the fire. And here she was, a stranger in her own way, treating it all as if it had no value beyond what she could seize. I had thought my son would stand with me, that his blood and shared memory would make him loyal. But he looked away, hesitant, unwilling to confront her or defend me. It was tempting to raise my voice, to make them see the error of their arrogance, to remind them who I was. But I stayed silent. I allowed the moment to stretch, each second a small test, each breath a reminder that this was not the end, only the beginning of something much larger. My silence was deliberate, a shield and a weapon, and I could feel its weight pressing back on the daughter-in-law. She didn't understand it yet, but I had learned over decades that appearances could deceive. The stronger you appeared, the more you were scrutinized. The weaker, the more underestimated. And in underestimation, there was power. After she finished her declaration, she turned to my son with a triumphant smile, expecting him to echo her confidence, to nod in agreement. But his eyes betrayed uncertainty, the kind that can grow in moments of observation, the kind that plants seeds of doubt. I noticed even if she didn't, and that small crack would matter later. I could see her calculating, adjusting, thinking that she had everything precisely in hand. She had no idea that the hand she thought she controlled was already holding the cards she could not see. I let her continue detailing which accounts she intended to manage, which parts of the house she believed were hers, and which decisions she thought she could make without question. Every word she spoke was a thread weaving her own overconfidence into the tapestry I was quietly unraveling in my mind. I noted discrepancies in her statements, contradictions in her assumed authority, and subtle missteps in her legal citations. It was all small, almost imperceptible, but I could see the pattern. Even the most careful manipulator leaves traces if you pay attention. When she finally paused, looking at me for the reaction she expected, I smiled faintly, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that spoke nothing but observation. "Take what you want," I said softly, letting my voice carry the weight of calm certainty. Her smile faltered for a moment, though she quickly recovered, masking it with a forced grin. I could feel the lawyer shift uncomfortably in his seat, unsure how to advise me. My son's hand twitched slightly as if he were about to speak, but decided against it. They all thought I had conceded, that I had been broken by grief and age. They could not have been more wrong. After the meeting, I sat alone in the living room, letting the initial shock fade. I walked slowly through the house, running my hand over the familiar furniture, the photographs, the trinkets my wife and I had collected over decades. Each item carried memory, each corner a reminder that this home was not hers to claim, no matter what documents she presented. And in that quiet, I began to see the possibilities. There were gaps, oversights, things she assumed she had mastered. And if I was patient, I could leverage them. I thought about my wife, how she had always prepared for contingencies, always anticipated challenges. For years, she had been guiding me subtly, teaching me through example and quiet counsel. Now, in her absence, I understood what she had meant by patience, by careful observation, by waiting for the precise moment to act. The daughter-in-law had made a fatal mistake. She had underestimated me, assumed my silence was weakness. And that assumption would become the foundation of my strategy. I began cataloging everything I could recall from the meeting. The documents, the way she held herself, the confidence in her voice, the hesitations in my son's tone. Every detail mattered, every gesture a clue. My silence would continue not out of fear or submission, but as a deliberate strategy. I would observe, calculate, and wait for the moment when the balance of power shifted entirely. She had claimed victory, but she had done so in ignorance of the unseen hand already shaping the outcome. By the time the evening light faded through the curtains, I had a plan forming in my mind. Not a plan born of anger, but one born of clarity, patience, and precise observation. The daughter-in-law thought she had taken everything. She had not. And when the time came, the surprise would be total, the reversal complete, and the lesson unmistakable silence. When wielded wisely, is far more powerful than any outburst. As I sat by the window, watching the last rays of the sun vanish behind the distant hills, I felt a strange serenity. The storm had passed, and yet the battle was only beginning. I would move carefully, deliberately, one step at a time. And when the moment came, she would realize too late that everything she believed she had gained had only been an illusion. The game was mine to control, and I had been holding the pieces all along. The morning after the meeting, I sat alone in the quiet of my home, the weight of her words still lingering in the air. The house was unusually still, as though it too had been holding its breath, while the daughter-in-law claimed dominion over everything I had spent decades building. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the steam curling up like a warning, a reminder that patience would be my ally, and observation my weapon. My lawyer, Martin, had called again early that morning, his voice tight with urgency, urging me to contest the estate, to push back, to reclaim what was legally mine. I let him speak without interruption, letting the tension in his words remind me that everyone expected panic from a 70-year-old man, that my silence would appear as submission. I traced the rim of my cup with a finger, thinking back to the brief conversation I had shared with my wife before she passed. She had always anticipated challenges, always warned that there were people who would mistake kindness and patience for weakness. Document everything she had said, her hands resting gently on mine as if to imprint the words into my memory. Notice patterns, note the little things, the tiny gestures, they're more revealing than shouting. Her voice echoed in my mind, comforting and steady, reminding me that the power of knowledge often outweighed the immediacy of action. By mid-morning, I began my review of the paperwork the daughter-in-law had left behind. At first glance, it appeared meticulously prepared. Every document signature and notation perfectly in order. But my wife had taught me to see beneath appearances, to read between the lines. I noticed minor inconsistencies, dates that didn't quite match signatures, slightly off-center pages that seemed out of sequence. Each anomaly was small on its own, nearly imperceptible to an untrained eye. But together they formed a pattern that suggested overconfidence, a fatal flaw in her supposed control. I spent hours moving through the home, examining my late wife's old letters and journals. In one dusty cabinet, I found a ledger I had long forgotten tucked behind volumes of financial records. The handwriting was hers, precise and deliberate, detailing accounts that had been hidden, funds that were not under my son or daughter-in-law's knowledge, assets that could not be claimed without triggering legal complications. My pulse quickened as I realized the scope of what she had prepared, the foresight she had applied to protect me even after her passing. The pieces were all there, waiting for someone patient enough to assemble them. Martin called again, insisting that time was of the essence, warning me that delays could allow the daughter-in-law to consolidate her power. I nodded silently, aware that to act too soon would reveal my hand and tip the scales in her favor. My observations were not just about the documents, they were about the people. I needed to understand her mindset, her assumptions, the overconfidence that blinded her to my subtle preparations. I had learned early in life that power was rarely exercised openly. It was accrued quietly, methodically, and only revealed when the moment was strategically perfect. My son appeared briefly in the late afternoon, lingering at the doorway with hesitant eyes. He had always been loyal, but the daughter-in-law's manipulation had begun to strain that bond. I noticed his discomfort as he avoided my gaze, shifting weight from one foot to the other, the unease of a man caught between two strong wills. I did not speak immediately, letting the silence draw out, allowing him to feel the gravity of the situation. In his hesitation, I saw an opening. His loyalty could be recovered if approached correctly, and the daughter-in-law's arrogance was providing the perfect opportunity. I returned to the ledger, following her notes meticulously. There were references to safe deposit boxes, property titles, and financial instruments that had been deliberately overlooked in her planning. The depth of her oversight was astonishing. But my wife had predicted it. I felt a quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes from recognizing a plan unfolding exactly as intended. Each discovery, each detail was a thread I could pull at the precise moment to unravel her assumed control. Patience, I reminded myself, was still the key. The game had only begun, and I had the advantage of invisibility in plain sight. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the study, I made my rounds through the home, observing spaces the daughter-in-law had claimed as hers. I noticed subtle changes she had implemented while I was away, furniture slightly rearranged, family photos adjusted, small items moved as though to signal dominance. Each alteration was a mark of her attempt to assert control, and each mistake, minor as it seemed, was a clue. She was meticulous, but impatient, confident, yet careless in her assumptions. I cataloged every detail in my mind, a silent dossier to be leveraged when the time was right. By evening, I had compiled a clear picture. She believed she had the upper hand, that my compliance signaled defeat, and that her control was complete. But appearances were a fragile mask. I could see now the pattern of her behavior. Every boast, every declaration, every tiny gesture of authority was rooted in an illusion of power. And illusions I knew could be shattered with careful, deliberate action. My wife's preparations had given me that power, waiting for the precise moment when I could reclaim it, not with noise or confrontation, but with precision and patience. I sat by the window, looking out at the fading light over the estate, letting the day's discoveries settle in my mind. The house, familiar and comforting, seemed almost alive in its quiet, as if acknowledging my presence, my vigilance. Every corner, every photograph, every shadow in the hallway reminded me of the life my wife and I had built, the legacy we had nurtured. And now, armed with the knowledge she had left behind, I felt a subtle shift within myself, a sense of control, of inevitability. Late that night, I revisited the letters and ledgers again, double-checking every detail, mapping out the potential outcomes, and visualizing the first step of the plan I would execute. It was a mental rehearsal, a preparation that no one else could see, a quiet sharpening of my strategy. The daughter-in-law's overconfidence would be her undoing, and my patience would be the instrument. Each observation, each detail, would later become a pivot point, a lever to shift the balance entirely in my favor. I allowed myself a brief smile, the kind that is quiet but full of promise. They thought I was a man, past his prime, grief-stricken and compliant. They did not understand the depth of preparation, the value of observation, the power in silence. This was not submission. It was strategy. And every moment I spent quietly gathering evidence, observing behavior, and studying documents was an investment in the inevitable reversal. I felt the weight of my wife's guidance behind me, her foresight a shield that extended beyond her passing, giving me clarity and strength. As midnight approached, I closed the ledger and set it carefully aside, already envisioning the next phase, the confrontation that would appear as compliance, but serve as the first visible move in reclaiming the estate. My heart, steady and calm, beat in rhythm with the patience I had cultivated over decades. The daughter-in-law believed she had won, that I was powerless. But she had underestimated the invisible hand, the quiet mind, and the legacy of foresight my wife had left me. In this silence, I was already preparing my victory. By the time I finally rose from my chair and walked to the window to see the stars reflected in the estate's still waters, I understood something profoundly simple. Patience and observation were more powerful than haste or confrontation. Every misstep she had made, every assumption she had clung to would serve as a key to unravel her control. And when the time came, the reversal would be complete, not with anger, not with force, but with the precision of someone who had seen every possibility and waited for the exact moment to act. I turned off the lights and left the study, walking slowly through the quiet house. The daughter-in-law believed she had taken everything, but she had not yet discovered the extent of what was hidden. And I, in my silence, was the only one who knew. The night was long, but my resolve was longer. The next chapter of this story would unfold exactly as it should, and those who had assumed victory would find that true power had been waiting quietly all along. The next morning, I returned to the estate, moving quietly through the familiar halls as if nothing had changed, though everything had. The daughter-in-law had already begun leaving traces of her control, small shifts in furniture, misplaced documents, and the faint scent of her perfume, lingering where it had no right to be. Every detail, every subtle change caught my attention. I made a mental note of them all, cataloging her movements like a chess master studying an opponent's strategy. She hadn't expected me to notice. That much was clear. The confidence she had displayed yesterday was still there, but it carried a weight of overreach, a fragility hidden beneath the surface. My son lingered in the background, awkward and hesitant, a man unsure of his loyalties. His eyes darted between me and his wife, betraying the inner conflict he could not voice aloud. I didn't need words to understand him. The quiet unease in his posture spoke volumes. I walked past the living room and noticed an envelope that had been left on the coffee table, slightly askew, addressed in a handwriting unfamiliar to me. My heart skipped a beat, and I picked it up carefully, sensing immediately that it contained something significant. Inside were documents that appeared to confirm my worst suspicions. My son had signed over partial authority to the daughter-in-law, without full knowledge of the estate's complexities. She had assumed control of accounts and property she did not fully understand, blind to the contingencies my wife had left in place. I sat down at the desk, spreading the papers before me, absorbing every line, every signature, every date. The more I examined them, the more the pattern became clear. The daughter-in-law's apparent triumph was built on assumptions, overconfidence, and a lack of awareness of the safeguards my wife had meticulously prepared. Each misstep, each oversight, was a small opening I could exploit when the time came. Patience had always been my ally, and now it would serve me fully. Later that afternoon, I met with Martin, my longtime lawyer. His voice trembled slightly over the phone as he urged me to act immediately to challenge the daughter-in-law's moves before she consolidated her position. I let him speak without interruption, absorbing the urgency in his tone while maintaining a calm exterior. I had learned that people who panic tend to reveal more than they intend, and I listened carefully for those clues. Martin could not see the full picture yet. He trusted my judgment, but he did not know the hidden pieces I had uncovered. As the day wore on, I began to notice subtler signs of her manipulation. The housekeeper, recently dismissed without explanation, had left behind small whispers of warning hints that the daughter-in-law had been coaching staff to treat me as incapable, to isolate me from the house and from my own son. Each revelation added weight to my understanding of her strategy. She had assumed everyone could be controlled through fear and projection, but she had underestimated the depth of my patience and the foresight my wife had left behind. I spent hours moving from room to room, retracing her steps and studying the minor alterations she had made. The kitchen, once orderly, now bore the mark of her influence. Drawers, slightly misaligned utensils, out-of-place notes left on counters as if to mark territory. Even the placement of family photos had been adjusted. Small changes meant to signal her dominance. But she had overlooked the significance of certain items, letters, ledgers, and documents my wife had left tucked away where only I would find them. These hidden elements were the first pieces of a larger puzzle, and I began assembling them meticulously in my mind. In the study, I discovered a ledger my wife had kept detailing accounts and properties that had never been disclosed. Each entry was precise, deliberate, and yet subtle enough to avoid detection. She had always known that someone might try to manipulate the estate, that someone might overreach. In the pursuit of control, my pulse quickened as I realized the extent of her planning. These documents were more than numbers. They were a map, a guide, a contingency plan for the unlikely, for the greedy, for the arrogant. I considered my son's reactions during yesterday's meeting. His unease had been faint, almost imperceptible. But now, with the knowledge I had gained, I could see the possibilities. He had been persuaded to align with his wife, but his loyalty had cracks. Small signs, a hesitation in his tone, a glance toward me, a barely audible sigh, revealed that he was beginning to see the cracks in her facade. Patience would allow me to guide him gently to restore his understanding without forcing confrontation. The daughter-in-law, on the other hand, was blind to these subtleties, assuming that her assertiveness had secured absolute control. I revisited the envelope I had found earlier, sifting through each document with painstaking care. There were bank accounts, property deeds, and legal instructions that she had overlooked. Some were accounts that required joint consent. Others involved trusts that could not be accessed without specific authorization. Each line was a reminder that she was operating under assumptions, and assumptions are dangerous when faced with someone who knows all the rules. By evening, I had mapped the first outlines of a strategy. The daughter-in-law believed she had the upper hand, but her ignorance of these safeguards made her vulnerable. I considered each step carefully, what to reveal, when to observe, when to remain silent. Each moment of patience was an investment, and each observation a note in the ledger of her eventual downfall. Later, as twilight settled over the estate, I walked through the halls that my wife and I had built together. The photographs of family, the mementos of shared years, the evidence of a life cultivated with care, all of it seemed to affirm my resolve. This house was not hers, not truly. It was a legacy, a story written over decades, and I had the key to protecting it. Her intrusion was temporary. My knowledge, patience, and planning were enduring. I began organizing the information I had gathered, taking meticulous notes, cross-referencing the documents, and identifying areas of potential leverage. Even small details, misfiled receipts, unusual signatures, patterns in her behavior were logged for future use. My wife had always emphasized the importance of observation, of noticing patterns that others dismiss. Now, with her guidance echoing in my mind, I could see the framework of a plan that would allow me to regain control without confrontation, without rash action, only through careful timing and precise execution. As night fell, I reflected on the psychological advantage I now held. The daughter-in-law's overconfidence, my son's uncertainty, the lawyer's impatience, all of it could be used to shape outcomes. The first step, I realized, was to continue my quiet observation, to collect evidence and understand motivations. The next step would be revealed when the moment was right, and it would be decisive. Before retiring for the night, I reviewed every document again, imagining how each one could be leveraged at the right moment. There were no sudden moves, no dramatic confrontations, only preparation strategy and a deep understanding of human behavior. I felt a strange sense of calm, knowing that the seeds of the reversal had been planted, and it was only a matter of time before they bore fruit. I walked slowly through the quiet halls, past the family portraits, past the spaces that had been claimed by her arrogance, and allowed myself a small smile. She believed she had taken everything from me, that my age and grief had rendered me powerless. She did not know that knowledge, patience, and careful observation are the most dangerous weapons of all. And as I looked out the window at the darkened estate, I understood that my role was not to fight blindly, but to watch, to learn, and to act with precision. The night settled over the estate like a protective shroud, and I felt the first stirrings of hope, the anticipation of a coming reversal. The daughter-in-law may have claimed authority, but she had not yet discovered the depth of what had been hidden, the foresight my wife had built into our lives. And when the moment came, she would find that every assumption she had made, every confident declaration, would be undone by the quiet, deliberate strategy that had been in motion all along. In the stillness of that night, I allowed myself to rest, knowing that the first steps toward reclaiming the estate had been taken not through confrontation, but through careful observation, patience, and the unwavering knowledge that every move she made was visible to me. Her victory was temporary. The ultimate outcome had already been quietly secured. And in that understanding, I found a rare peace, knowing that the story of this house, this estate, and this family would not end with her triumph. Martin's voice came through the phone that morning like a torrent, urgent, insistent, desperate. "Elias, you can't just sit there. You have to contest this now. She's moving faster than we anticipated. You need to act before she consolidates everything." I leaned back in my chair, listening to the rapid-fire instructions, the legal terms, the warnings, and allowed him to continue without interruption. Each word he spoke only reinforced what I already knew. The daughter-in-law's arrogance had created opportunities, and my silence was now the sharpest weapon I possessed. I didn't respond immediately. I let the call stretch on, feeling the tension in his voice and the impatience behind it. He could not see the calm in my expression, could not know that every warning he issued had already been considered in my mind. I had long since learned that people in panic reveal more than they intend. Every repetition, every insistence was a thread I could pull, a small insight into his fears, and by extension, the vulnerabilities of those who had assumed they could outmaneuver me. Once he paused for breath, I replied softly, "I understand, Martin. I'll consider your advice." The words were neutral, almost dismissive. But inside, I was already reviewing the plan my wife had left for such a moment. Her foresight had always astounded me, the meticulous care with which she had prepared for contingencies that most people would never even imagine. She had foreseen manipulation, overreach, and greed, and had embedded safeguards throughout the estate. I hung up and began to walk through the rooms of the estate, observing what had changed in my absence. The daughter-in-law's influence was already visible, the way furniture had been rearranged. Subtle alterations in the placement of family photographs and a few personal items moved without explanation. At first, these changes seemed trivial, but each was a marker, a signal of her desire to assert control. I cataloged every detail mentally, noting which alterations reflected confidence, which reflected insecurity, and which were mere distractions. In the kitchen, I found another envelope partially hidden under a stack of bills. This one was subtler than the first, unassuming, and addressed in a handwriting I didn't recognize. I opened it carefully and discovered invoices, receipts, and minor legal notes that hinted at irregularities in how the daughter-in-law was attempting to manage the estate. The documents alone were not significant, but together they formed a pattern, confirming my suspicion that she had made assumptions not just about the estate, but about me and the patience I would maintain. I paused in the living room, letting the afternoon sun fall across the worn carpet, thinking about my son. He had always been loyal, but the daughter-in-law had begun to assert influence over him, subtly convincing him that his best path was to defer to her decisions. Yet in small ways, I could see his hesitation, the flickers of doubt that betrayed his discomfort. He wanted to do what was right, but fear and manipulation had clouded his judgment. I made a note of each nuance, each glance and hesitation, storing them for later use, when it would matter most. The day passed in quiet study. I revisited my wife's old letters and journals, tracing the careful foresight she had applied in preparation for just such a scenario. She had always emphasized observation and patience. Every small detail matters, she had written in her meticulous hand. A gesture, a phrase, a misfiled document. These are your guides. Never underestimate the value of attention. I reviewed every page with renewed focus, identifying the mechanisms she had left behind to safeguard the estate, and more importantly, to preserve my authority and dignity. Martin called again late in the afternoon, his voice heavy with concern. "Elias, every day you wait, she solidifies her hold. You need to challenge her immediately. Don't give her any chance to cover her tracks." I listened, and then I allowed myself a small, quiet smile. He did not know that every track she had left was visible to me, every assumption she had made, accounted for. My wife's foresight had given me clarity and control, and I intended to use it fully in the right moment with precision. As evening fell, I walked slowly through the hallways, observing the smallest signs of her presence. The faint scuff on the carpet near the entrance, a misplaced paper on the side table, the deliberate arrangement of the dining room. Each adjustment, each alteration spoke to her attempts to assert dominance, and each error revealed vulnerabilities. I cataloged them all mentally, preparing for the eventual confrontation, noting where patience would serve me best and where observation would yield the greatest advantage. I paused in the study, taking the ledger my wife had left tucked away years ago. Within it were references to hidden accounts, trusts, and legal contingencies that the daughter-in-law could not have anticipated. Each notation was precise, deliberate, a map of power carefully concealed until the moment it was needed. My pulse quickened as I realized the scale of her foresight and the opportunity it provided me. I traced the details methodically, identifying where her assumptions had failed, where she had overreached, and how I could leverage this knowledge when the time was right. Later, I moved to the kitchen, where I poured myself a second cup of coffee. The air was quiet, the house seemingly asleep, but I could feel the invisible tension lingering, as if the walls themselves remembered the confrontation of yesterday. The daughter-in-law's confidence had not wavered, but it had left traces. Every action she had taken to assert control was a signal, a weakness masked as dominance. I could see them clearly now, each one a potential pivot in the plan I was quietly assembling. By nightfall, I had reviewed every document, every minor detail, and every personal interaction. I mapped out the first phase of what would become a larger strategy: observe, understand, and wait. No action would be taken prematurely. My wife's contingencies had created a framework, and I intended to follow it precisely, ensuring that when the time came, every move would be deliberate, every reaction calculated, and the reversal complete. I wandered through the hallways one last time, past the photographs of our family, past the mementos of shared years, and let my gaze linger on the spaces the daughter-in-law had attempted to claim. She thought she had inserted herself into the life we had built, that she had seized control. But in truth, the foundations of authority, of ownership, of legacy were far beyond her reach. Every adjustment she had made, every assertion of dominance, was accounted for, noted, and prepared for in the plan my wife had left me. Sitting in the living room as darkness fell, I allowed myself a moment of quiet reflection. Patience, observation, and preparation were far more potent than hasty action or angry confrontation. She believed she had won. She did not know that the house, the documents, the legacy, and my son's loyalty could all be influenced quietly, invisibly, until the moment of revelation. That moment would come, and it would be decisive. Before retiring for the night, I revisited the letters once more, absorbing her guidance, her careful instructions, and the subtle hints she had left behind. Each page reinforced my understanding that true power is often unseen, that silence can be a shield, a weapon, and a tool of observation. I knew that the next phase would require patience and precision, and I was ready. The first moves had been observed, the weaknesses noted, and the eventual reversal already within reach. As I switched off the lights and walked slowly to my room, I felt a quiet sense of control. The daughter-in-law's confidence would soon meet the reality she had not anticipated, and the strategy my wife had embedded in our lives would finally be executed. The night was still the house asleep, and I knew that in this silence I was preparing for the first steps toward reclaiming everything that had been taken without haste, without confrontation, only with precision and patience. The day of the formal meeting arrived with a quiet tension that seemed to seep into every corner of the house. The daughter-in-law arrived early, radiating confidence, her heels clicking against the marble floor with a rhythm that suggested authority. My son trailed slightly behind her, nervous and hesitant, and Martin, my lawyer, followed with the briefcase clutched tightly in his hand. I met them all in the living room, calm and measured, carrying only a small folder of personal notes I had prepared. She greeted me with a smile smug and assured the kind that implied victory before the battle even began. "I trust we can finalize everything today," she said, her voice confident, unyielding. She gestured toward the documents already spread on the polished coffee table, the papers that she believed secured her absolute control. Everyone expected me to react to protest, to demand my due. But I didn't. I simply nodded and sat down, observing her with a quiet attentiveness that made her pause for a fraction of a second, though she quickly masked it. The lawyer on her side, a sharp man with an authoritative air, spoke first, outlining the legal procedures and reminding us of the steps that had been taken to formalize the daughter-in-law's authority over the estate. He spoke quickly, confident in the assumption that nothing would challenge her claim. Martin remained composed but alert, occasionally glancing at me, waiting for a sign, a signal, any hint that I might intervene. I gave him none. My silence, deliberate and measured, seemed to unsettle both of them, though neither could identify why. I began signing the documents, each signature deliberate and slow, each movement calculated. The daughter-in-law watched intently, her smile widening as she interpreted my calmness as submission. She believed she had finally cornered me, that her victory was complete. My son's hands fidgeted nervously in his lap, the hesitation in his movements betraying the internal conflict he could not voice. He was caught between loyalty to me and loyalty to his wife, and I observed every subtle gesture, storing them in my mind for the future. As I signed, I paid careful attention to her expressions and the micro-gestures that betrayed overconfidence. She leaned back in her chair, the smile never faltering, yet her eyes darted briefly to the papers I held. She assumed control had already passed entirely into her hands, unaware of the critical elements she had overlooked. Each page I signed, each checkmark and initial, was a step in a process she thought she dominated, but in reality, it was part of the careful orchestration my wife had left behind for situations just like this. Minutes passed, and I continued signing methodically, moving from one document to the next. The air in the room was heavy with expectation, tension coiling like a spring, waiting to release. My calm composure created a strange sense of unease. The daughter-in-law, though outwardly self-assured, began to reveal small cracks in her armor. A slight hesitation when I signed the papers concerning the main account, a subtle tightening of her hands when I initialed the property deeds. Each of these tiny signals reinforced the understanding I had gained. From my careful observation, she believed herself untouchable, yet she was overextending, leaving openings. I allowed her to continue speaking, detailing her plans for the estate, her intended management of accounts, and the roles she believed she had secured. Every declaration was a thread she wove, but each was also a thread I cataloged, noting contradictions and assumptions she had made. My son shifted again in his chair, uncomfortable, aware that I had noticed more than she suspected. He wanted to assert his own perspective, but seemed unsure how to proceed without upsetting his wife. The subtle dynamics of fear over confidence and hesitation played out before me, a tableau of human behavior I had been studying carefully for weeks. The meeting continued, and the daughter-in-law began reviewing the documents herself, flipping through pages with a certain authority, pointing out what she assumed were completed actions and signatures she believed solidified her control. Martin, sensing the tension, leaned slightly forward, ready to interject, but I raised a hand, subtly, a reminder that the moment for interference was not yet. Each document I had previously studied, each discrepancy I had noted, was now positioned strategically in my mind for the moment it would matter most. After an hour, she paused, looking at me with a triumphant gleam, certain she had demonstrated full control. My calm response, a subtle nod and neutral expression, was interpreted as further confirmation of her victory. I continued signing the last of the documents, and the daughter-in-law leaned back, arms crossed, satisfied. She had assumed rightly, in part, that appearances were everything. She had miscalculated my patience, my observation, and the hidden contingencies my wife had embedded within the estate's structure. Once the signing was complete, I closed the final folder and set it aside. I felt the weight of every observation, every calculation, every moment of patience culminating quietly within me. The daughter-in-law believed she had won, that the house, the accounts, and the management of the estate were securely in her hands. But she had not accounted for the nuances, the small oversights, the contingencies prepared for exactly this kind of overreach. My silence, my compliance had been the perfect disguise for my awareness and the preparation of a carefully constructed counter-strategy. I looked at my son, noticing the subtle relief in his posture now that the formalities were complete. He had begun to sense the vulnerabilities, the cracks in his wife's assumptions, though he did not yet know their full significance. Even in the lawyer's cautious glances, I could see recognition of the controlled calm I maintained, and perhaps a dawning realization that the apparent submission was a deliberate and strategic posture. The daughter-in-law, believing her triumph unquestionable, began discussing plans for the estate's management with her lawyer, outlining steps she thought were irreversible. Each statement, each confident assertion was catalogued in my mind, a record of overconfidence and a map of potential leverage. My wife had taught me to observe patterns, to notice gestures, inconsistencies, and assumptions. Each one of these was a key waiting for the right moment. By late afternoon, the meeting drew to a close. Everyone stood exchanging formal pleasantries, though the tension remained palpable beneath the surface. I gathered my personal notes and stood slowly, allowing the daughter-in-law to maintain the illusion of dominance. My son followed me with cautious eyes, his loyalty subtly shifting as he observed my composure and the care with which I managed each interaction. Martin flanked me quietly, reassuring me, understanding that the real maneuvering was invisible to all except us. As I walked through the halls, now empty and quiet, I considered the events of the day. The first phase of the plan had been executed flawlessly. Compliance disguised awareness, patience, concealed calculation, and every tiny detail of the daughter-in-law's overconfidence had been catalogued. I had observed, studied, and mentally recorded every signal, every inconsistency, and every assumption she had made. The foundation for the next phase was firmly in place, and when the moment arrived, the reversal would be total. That evening, I returned to my study and laid out the documents and notes I had collected over the past weeks. The ledger from my wife, the observations of my son's hesitations, the subtle errors in her documentation, all were now aligned in a single coherent strategy. I began to mentally trace the sequence of moves I would make, the timing, and the leverage points I would exploit. Every small observation became a piece of a larger puzzle, each carefully considered and weighted. By midnight, the house was silent, except for the faint hum of the heating system and the occasional creak of the wooden floors settling. I sat at my desk, reviewing every document once more, visualizing the moment when the daughter-in-law's confidence would collide with the truth she had failed to anticipate. Patience had carried me this far. Observation had guided me, and now preparation would ensure that the outcome would be precisely what it needed to be: complete, measured, and irreversible. In the quiet of that night, I allowed a subtle smile to cross my face. She believed she had taken everything, that her triumph was total. But she did not see the foundation, beneath the surface, the invisible scaffolding my wife had left behind to protect our legacy and my authority. And when the time came, when the strategy I had been patiently assembling revealed itself, the outcome would be undeniable. Victory in this game was not about immediate confrontation, but about timing, knowledge, and precision. I turned off the lamp and stood looking through the window at the darkened estate. The daughter-in-law had her moment of perceived victory, but she had not yet discovered the depth of what she had underestimated. I could see clearly now that the next steps would unfold exactly as I had planned. And when they did, everyone who had doubted me would realize that true power often resides in silence, observation, and the patience to wait for the perfect moment. After the meeting, I retreated to a quiet room in the house I had built, the one place where I could breathe without feeling watched. The daughter-in-law believed she had won, that my compliance was surrender. She did not know that the real game had only just begun. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat at the desk opening the first of the envelopes my late wife had left tucked away years ago. Each envelope contained instructions, documents, and hints she had carefully hidden, anticipating a day like this. Bank accounts, property deeds, letters, everything was designed to remain concealed until the right moment. My pulse quickened as I began reading, realizing the extent of her foresight. My wife had never trusted appearances. She had always insisted that patience and knowledge were stronger than brute force. And now, her planning was revealing itself in ways that the daughter-in-law could never have anticipated. I spent hours carefully going through every document, cross-referencing account numbers, property records, and legal clauses. Some assets were untouched, lying beyond the reach of any claims the daughter-in-law had made. Others were bound by contingencies that could only be executed with my authority. Every page told a story of preparation, foresight, and meticulous care. Each small discovery was like a spark, illuminating a path I had been charting silently. Martin called twice that afternoon, urging immediate legal action. I listened, absorbing his concern, letting him speak without revealing the advantage I now held. "Elias, you can't delay," he said. "She's consolidating control, and if you don't act, it will be too late." I nodded quietly, letting him think I was weighing his advice carefully, when in truth I had already assessed the situation. My wife's plan had created layers of protection that would nullify any premature move. Patience, as she had taught me, would yield far more than haste. Later, I began to trace the daughter-in-law's previous maneuvers, recalling her confidence during the signing, the subtle ways she manipulated my son, and the errors in her documentation. Each misstep, no matter how minor, was a clue, a sign of overconfidence that she assumed no one would notice. I noted patterns in her behavior, the way she relied on intimidation and assumption, unaware that she was leaving herself exposed to the very precision she had not considered. I moved through the house, revisiting the areas she had altered. The living room, the kitchen, even the hallways bore evidence of her attempts to claim dominance. Furniture slightly shifted, photographs, repositioned notes left carelessly, each adjustment signaling overconfidence, each one catalogued in my mind. In contrast, I felt the weight of history, of legacy, and the subtle power embedded in the objects and spaces she believed she controlled. The house itself seemed to confirm what I already knew. Authority was never hers to seize. Hours passed in quiet observation. I returned to the envelopes, discovering the first hidden account, a small financial instrument that she had entirely overlooked. Its significance was subtle on paper, but I could see how it would allow me to shift control without immediate confrontation. My pulse remained calm, my movements deliberate. This was the work my wife had prepared for, a test of patience and observation, and now the time to understand it had come. I recalled earlier conversations with my wife about the importance of timing. She had emphasized that revelation at the wrong moment could ruin even the most carefully laid plan. I reviewed her notes again mentally, mapping how each hidden account, each legal clause, each contingency could interact. She had thought through every possible scenario, and I was now in the position to orchestrate the outcome. My calm exterior belied the meticulous calculations running through my mind. My son appeared in the study, unexpectedly lingering at the doorway. His eyes were hesitant, darting between me and the papers on my desk. He had begun to sense the cracks in his wife's assumptions, though he did not yet know the full extent. I let him observe without speaking, giving him space to internalize what he was seeing. His subtle body language, the slight slump of his shoulders, the tension in his hands was telling. Loyalty is often complicated, but it can be influenced quietly without force if guided carefully. I spent the remainder of the afternoon tracing connections between the accounts, the property deeds, and the contingencies outlined in my wife's notes. I discovered that some legal instruments could only be executed under specific conditions. Conditions the daughter-in-law had unknowingly created through her overreach. Every small detail reinforced the reality she had assumed victory, but her understanding of control was superficial. My patience had revealed a map she could not see, and the foundation for a reversal was now fully visible. By evening, I organized all the documents on the study table, aligning them in order of importance and potential leverage. I reviewed each anomaly in her paperwork, each minor oversight, and each behavioral cue I had observed over the past days. Each element formed a lattice of opportunity, a framework for reclaiming control without confrontation. The daughter-in-law's confidence, once intimidating, now appeared fragile and miscalculated. Every assumption she had made was now a potential pivot point. The house was quiet, the day giving way to night, and I finally allowed myself a moment to reflect. The first phase of preparation was complete observation, had yielded insight. Patience had preserved clarity, and the hidden plan my wife had left behind was beginning to reveal itself. I felt a sense of control I hadn't realized I was capable of, a clarity of purpose and strategy that would guide the next phase. I walked slowly through the estate, examining the spaces the daughter-in-law had altered, the subtle markings of her attempts to assert authority. The photographs, the furniture, even the small personal items, she had moved all of it, spoke of her overconfidence. I cataloged every detail mentally, noting where leverage could be applied, where timing would be critical, and where restraint would enhance the effectiveness of the strategy. My silence had become a tool, a method of gathering information and shaping outcomes, invisibly. By late night, I returned to the study and reviewed the notes once more, visualizing how each element could be utilized in the coming days. The hidden accounts, the legal contingencies, the behavioral cues, all were aligned for the moment when action would be decisive. The daughter-in-law, confident in her assumed victory, had no awareness of the invisible web that was already forming around her. My wife's foresight had ensured that I would have the advantage, and now it was time to continue executing it with precision. Before retiring, I walked past the photographs of family and friends, past the memorabilia of decades spent building a life, and let the weight of responsibility and opportunity settle within me. The daughter-in-law may have thought she controlled everything, but she had underestimated the depth of preparation, the value of observation, and the quiet power of patience. As I closed the study door and turned off the lights, I knew that the next phase of this story would unfold exactly as planned, and the reversal, when it came, would be absolute and undeniable. I sat at the edge of the study desk. The envelope my wife had left me in my hand, the wax seal still faintly warm from years past. I had opened several letters already, but this one felt different. It was heavier, more deliberate, and it carried a weight of foresight that only she could have imagined. Carefully breaking the seal, I slid out the papers, and my eyes widened as I began to understand the magnitude of what she had left. Bank accounts, property deeds, and legal instruments, each layered with contingencies and instructions, had been hidden with meticulous care. The daughter-in-law believed she had secured everything. She had assumed control of the estate, confident in her knowledge and authority. But what lay before me was a reminder that her power was superficial. My wife had anticipated greed, manipulation, and overreach. She had accounted for every potential assumption and mistake, embedding safeguards that would now serve as my leverage. I traced my finger along the ledgers, noting the subtle notations, the carefully coded instructions that revealed where real authority truly lay. Hours passed as I reviewed each document. One account, small yet significant, had been set up to require joint consent, something the daughter-in-law would never be able to access alone. A property deed tucked away in a folder, labeled innocuously with a date from 10 years ago, could not be contested without a legal notice I already possessed. Each page, each line carried foresight and planning. My wife had designed these protections not only to secure the estate, but also to empower me when the time was right. I paused, leaning back in my chair, recalling our conversations from years before. She had always emphasized patience, observation, and careful consideration over rash action. Never show your hand too soon, she had told me. The more they believe they have control, the easier it will be to reveal the truth at the perfect moment. Her words echoed in my mind now, resonating with clarity. The daughter-in-law's arrogance, her overconfidence, was playing right into the structure my wife had left. I could see it all unfold in my mind, their expectations, her assumptions, and the first move I would make when the time was right. I reviewed the letters again, noting small references to accounts and properties she had expected to be overlooked. There were instructions for discreet observation, for tracking behaviors, for noting errors in judgment. Even the smallest gesture, the way she positioned herself during meetings, the way she spoke with my son, had been anticipated. My wife had prepared me not just with legal safeguards, but with insight into human behavior, a map to guide my patience and strategic timing. The day faded into afternoon, and I moved through the house, revisiting the rooms that the daughter-in-law had altered during her assumed ascendancy. Furniture slightly shifted, photographs repositioned, and the smallest trinkets moved, as if to mark territory. She had thought to impose her will physically, visually, and psychologically. But every adjustment was a subtle misstep, a clue to her overconfidence. I cataloged them all, building a mental map of her errors and the openings they presented. My son appeared briefly in the doorway, lingering, hesitating, as he often did. His eyes betrayed concern, a flicker of recognition that perhaps he had aligned with the wrong side. I did not speak, letting him observe, letting the tension settle in. He had begun to see the gaps in her assumptions, though he did not yet know the full extent. Observation, as my wife had taught me, was as much a weapon as any legal maneuver. By letting him witness my calm and deliberate study, I subtly reminded him that patience and knowledge carried power far beyond impulsive action. Returning to the desk, I traced the interconnections between accounts, deeds, and contingencies. I discovered hidden clauses that would allow me to assert authority under specific conditions that she had inadvertently created through overreach. Each minor oversight, each assumption she had made, strengthened the position I now held. My heart remained calm, but my mind raced with possibilities, strategies, and the precise timing required to execute them effectively. I paused to consider the daughter-in-law's mindset. She believed her triumph was absolute. She was confident, assertive, and unaware of the protections my wife had embedded throughout the estate. This overconfidence was her undoing. Each assertion of control she had made was a thread in the larger tapestry I was beginning to assemble, a series of moves that would eventually unravel her assumed authority. I cataloged every boast, every confident gesture, and every minor misstep, knowing that these would all play a role in the eventual reversal. The house was quiet, the sun beginning to set, casting long shadows across the floors. I moved slowly from room to room, considering every detail. The living room, where she had placed herself most confidently, revealed signs of her impatience: a chair slightly too close to a table, a document that had been hastily reviewed, a note she had assumed I would never notice. These small imperfections reinforced the understanding I had gained from the letters and ledgers. She had underestimated the depth of preparation and observation she was facing. I settled back at the desk, reviewing the most critical documents once more. A set of bank accounts, seemingly inconspicuous, could be leveraged to assert immediate control if necessary. Property holdings, carefully documented and legally protected, could not be accessed without my approval. Each line, each clause was a carefully placed instrument of authority. My wife had not only protected the estate, but had ensured that I would be able to reclaim it when the moment was right. As night fell, I allowed myself a rare moment of quiet reflection. The daughter-in-law had thought herself victorious. She had not yet discovered the depth of the safeguards. My patience had been tested, and observation had rewarded me with clarity. The first phase of my strategy was complete. I understood the landscape, I had identified the vulnerabilities, and I knew how to leverage them. The power she assumed she held was in fact an illusion, and I now possessed the knowledge and preparations to shift the balance decisively. I walked through the hallways one last time before retiring for the night, touching the familiar surfaces, tracing the memory of years spent in this house. The photographs, the mementos, the furniture, all were part of the foundation my wife had built for me to protect and reclaim. Her foresight was evident in every hidden clause, every overlooked account, and every small notation she had made. I felt a quiet confidence, a certainty that the reversal would come, not through confrontation, but through strategy, precision, and the patient execution of the plan she had left me. By the time I turned off the lights, the house was silent, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight. The daughter-in-law may have believed she had taken everything, but she had not yet encountered the full measure of the protections my wife had embedded. I closed the ledger, placing it carefully in its hidden compartment, and allowed myself a small knowing smile. The next phase of the plan would unfold in due time, and when it did, her confidence so carefully cultivated would be shattered. In that silence, I felt a rare satisfaction. Observation, patience, and preparation had brought me to this point. The daughter-in-law's assumed control was nothing more than a facade, and every error she had made had become a stepping stone in the larger plan. The night was long, but my resolve was longer. I had seen the pieces, understood the strategy, and now all that remained was timing, and the careful, deliberate execution of what my wife had prepared for me so many years ago. The following morning, I made my way to the small office where the most critical documents were kept, a place few had access to, and fewer still could have imagined held the key to the estate. The daughter-in-law had assumed her triumph was absolute. She did not realize that what she had taken control over was only a fraction of the truth. My pulse remained steady as I unlocked the cabinet, retrieving a set of folders that had been deliberately concealed. The weight of years of preparation pressed on me, and a quiet satisfaction filled me as I began to understand the full measure of my wife's foresight. I sat at the desk and began to sort through the papers. There were bank accounts she did not know existed. Trusts created years ago under conditions no one could access, without my authorization, and legal clauses so intricately constructed that any attempt to override them would have revealed the daughter-in-law's assumptions as false. My wife had anticipated greed, overreach, and arrogance, and she had embedded protections accordingly. Every signature, every note, every instruction was precise, and together they formed a web of authority that she could not penetrate. As I traced the documents, a clear pattern emerged. The daughter-in-law's overconfidence had created gaps in her own control. She had believed that she could manage the estate unchallenged, assuming that my compliance equaled submission. But the ledgers, accounts, and legal contingencies my wife had left were a testament to patience and foresight. They were my leverage, and with them I could navigate the next steps with a certainty she could not foresee. I recalled the moments from the signing, the way she had gestured confidently, speaking with authority that was meant to intimidate. My son had shifted uncomfortably beside her, caught between loyalty and doubt, and the lawyers had been forced to observe my calm demeanor. All of it, I realized, had played into my advantage. The outward display of surrender had been necessary to allow me to study, to observe, and to prepare for the decisive moment. My wife had taught me the value of patience, and that lesson had never been clearer. I began cross-referencing the newly discovered documents with the ones I had already examined over the past days. Bank accounts, matched trusts, property titles, matched legal contingencies, and small inconsistencies. In the daughter-in-law's paperwork became glaring opportunities. She had made assumptions about her control that were convenient for her, not grounded in reality. Every overreach, every misstep, every display of arrogance now presented a pivot point I could exploit with precision. Hours passed in meticulous review. I traced each account, each legal clause, and each property deed, understanding how the daughter-in-law's attempts at authority had left traces of vulnerability. She had assumed absolute control, yet she had neglected to anticipate the contingencies my wife had embedded. These oversights were subtle, but when aligned with the patterns of behavior I had observed, they became a roadmap for the reversal that was coming. The son appeared again, briefly lingering at the edge of the study. His eyes were wary, and he spoke cautiously, hinting at minor doubts he had begun to harbor. I let him see the documents and note my calm examination without offering explanation. Observation was as much a weapon as the legal tools themselves, and his growing awareness of the discrepancies in his wife's assumed authority was already shaping the dynamics of the family. He did not yet understand the full scope, but he was beginning to perceive that control had been misrepresented. I returned to the hidden safe, unlocking the final folder with the key I had discovered earlier. Inside were the most critical pieces, instructions for activating the hidden account's legal provisions, granting me sole authority under specific conditions, and evidence that contradicted several of the daughter-in-law's claims. This was the core of my leverage, the part of the plan my wife had preserved for the precise moment when patience and preparation would intersect with opportunity. I traced each instruction carefully, understanding the sequence and the timing required for the reversal to be effective. As the afternoon sunlight faded through the blinds, I began to outline a strategy for the first phase of reclaiming control. The daughter-in-law was unaware of these protections, unaware of the depth of foresight my wife had embedded in the estate's structure. Every overconfident assertion she had made, every minor mistake was now a lever I could pull to shift the balance. The realization settled in with clarity. Her apparent dominance was fragile, and my position was far stronger than she imagined. I reviewed the legal language in the documents, identifying specific clauses that would allow me to assert authority if challenged. The accounts previously invisible could be activated to offset her perceived control. The trusts previously obscure were structured to prevent unilateral access. Even the minor inconsistencies in her paperwork could be used to demonstrate error and overreach. Each discovery strengthened my confidence, and with it my resolve to execute the plan carefully, deliberately, and at the right moment. Evening approached, and I walked through the halls of the estate, revisiting spaces the daughter-in-law had altered during her brief assertion of control. Furniture slightly shifted, photographs, repositioned notes left carelessly. Each small change a reflection of her overconfidence. I cataloged them mentally, linking these minor gestures to the vulnerabilities I had uncovered in the legal documents. Every action she had taken became a clue, a stepping stone toward the reversal that would soon unfold. By nightfall, I had mapped every account deed and clause, aligning them with the behavioral patterns I had observed over the past days. The daughter-in-law believed she had taken everything. But in reality, the essential elements of control, the hidden accounts, the legal contingencies, the evidence of her overreach remained firmly within my reach. The first phase of the plan, the quiet observation and careful review, had been completed flawlessly. I sat at my desk reviewing the entire strategy, tracing the path I would follow in the coming days. Timing would be critical. Action taken too soon could undermine the advantage I now held. Each decision, each revelation, each interaction would need to be executed with precision. Patience had brought me to this point, and only by maintaining it would I be able to reveal the full scope of the protections my wife had left and reclaim the estate without confrontation. Finally, I closed the ledger and returned it to its hidden compartment. I stood by the window looking out at the quiet estate, the evening settling over the grounds like a protective shroud. The daughter-in-law may have believed she had seized complete control, but she had underestimated the depth of foresight, the meticulous planning, and the quiet intelligence that now guided me. Every misstep she had made, every assumption she had clung to, had been noted, catalogued, and prepared for. The night was calm, but my mind remained alert, reviewing contingencies and mapping potential moves. The reversal, when it came, would be absolute. Patience, observation, and preparation had yielded a position of power she could not have imagined. And as I turned off the desk lamp and walked quietly through the darkened halls, I felt the satisfaction that comes not from confrontation, but from knowledge, strategy, and the quiet certainty that the truth and the control it provided was already mine. The day of the final meeting arrived with a weight that pressed against my chest even before I stepped into the room. The daughter-in-law had scheduled it herself, confident in her assumed victory, unaware that I held the real leverage. I walked through the familiar halls of the estate, my footsteps quiet against the polished floors, observing the shadows, the subtle creaks of the house that had seen decades of family life. It was a calm I had cultivated deliberately, a mask of ease that belied the careful planning running through my mind. She greeted me at the door, smiling with that same overconfidence she had carried since she first asserted control. "We'll finalize everything today," she said, her tone sharp with authority. My son hovered near her, uneasy, shifting from foot to foot, as though the floor itself was betraying his discomfort. Martin followed behind me, his briefcase in hand, alert but silent, understanding that the first phase of our plan had been executed flawlessly, and that patience was still our ally. The room was arranged formally. Documents, neatly stacked, pens placed strategically for signing, chairs positioned for the appearance of order. The daughter-in-law seated herself at the head, her posture rigid, her eyes scanning me and my lawyer as though to measure our intentions. She had no idea that everything she believed she controlled was only a surface layer, that the estate's true protections, the contingencies my wife had embedded, and the careful observations I had made, were all hidden beneath her notice. Martin spoke first, reviewing procedural steps and cautioning her that legal formalities needed to be observed. He assumed the documents in front of us would be signed without resistance, and he was not wrong. The daughter-in-law's lawyer leaned forward, nodding confidently, certain that her client's dominance was absolute. I remained seated, calm and collected, allowing them to make the first gestures of control. My silence was deliberate, and it unnerved both of them in ways they could not articulate. I began signing the documents, each signature slow and precise, measured to convey compliance, but devoid of surrender. The daughter-in-law watched intently, her smile never faltering, though I could detect subtle signs of internal calculation. Tiny adjustments in posture, a flicker of the eyes, a quick inhale. She assumed I was merely accepting what she had taken. But every line I signed, every initial I added, was a note in the mental ledger I had been keeping for weeks. The son shifted uncomfortably beside her, the tension in his shoulders betraying the conflict he felt. He wanted to assert some opinion, some hesitation, but the daughter-in-law's confidence and the formal setting held him back. I watched him, noting each gesture, each glance, storing it for the moments when subtle persuasion could sway him without confrontation. Observation. I had learned from my wife often carried more weight than argument or evidence alone. The daughter-in-law continued speaking, outlining her perceived authority and the management steps she intended to enforce. Each statement was catalogued in my mind, a record of overconfidence and assumption. She had not accounted for the accounts hidden from her, the contingencies she could not access, and the minor discrepancies in her paperwork that could be exploited at the right moment. Every assertion of dominance she made, every confident smile only reinforced the structure of the plan I had been carefully building. Hours passed in the room filled with the quiet hum of formal discussion. I signed the remaining documents without hesitation, presenting an exterior of compliance. Martin remained alert, occasionally glancing at me, knowing I held the advantage, but trusting my judgment entirely. The daughter-in-law, meanwhile, radiated a self-assured calm, unaware of the growing fragility of her position. The room, so meticulously arranged, had become the stage for the first visible act of the reversal that would soon unfold. As the meeting drew to a close, the daughter-in-law leaned back in her chair, satisfied with the appearance of control. She believed she had secured everything. My son was silent but perceptibly tense, his loyalty subtly shifting as he observed the calm determination I maintained. Even her lawyer seemed confident, yet he did not anticipate the depth of the hidden protections, nor the patience and strategy guiding my actions. Once all documents were signed, I gathered my personal notes and stood moving deliberately to show poise without revealing the advantage I held. The daughter-in-law's smile remained triumphant in its apparent completeness, but I could see the tension beneath it, the subtle cracks that overconfidence always creates. My son followed me with careful steps, sensing perhaps instinctively that the balance of power was not as absolute as it seemed. I allowed them to speak through the final formalities, letting the daughter-in-law dictate the next steps, believing she had orchestrated her own victory. Every gesture, every word she spoke reinforced the evidence I had catalogued over weeks, her assumptions, her miscalculations, and her reliance on appearances. I remained silent, observing, understanding that the first visible phase had been executed flawlessly. My compliance had been convincing, but the real advantage, hidden and unassailable, was fully intact. After the meeting, I walked alone through the house, touching surfaces and reviewing spaces that she had claimed as her own. The subtle shifts, the rearranged photographs, and the minor adjustments in decor all were evidence of her assumed authority. Each error, each overconfidence had been catalogued mentally, providing clues for the next phase of the plan. My patient's observation and meticulous attention to detail had turned the apparent surrender into a strategic positioning that she could not yet comprehend. By late afternoon, I returned to the study, opening the envelope that had guided the first phase of my strategy. The documents inside reminded me of the hidden accounts, the legal clauses, and the contingencies that were the cornerstone of the reversal I had been preparing for. Each line, each clause, each instruction was precise, embedded with foresight, and now it was clear that the daughter-in-law's assumptions about her victory were completely misguided. The power she assumed she wielded had never been hers to claim. I spent the remaining hours reviewing every legal instrument, noting how each might be activated in the coming days. The daughter-in-law had made subtle errors, and my careful observation had recorded every one. My son's gradual awareness of these discrepancies provided additional leverage that I could use discreetly, guiding his perspective without direct confrontation. Every element, every subtle detail, contributed to a framework of control that would soon be undeniable. Night fell, and I walked through the hallways one last time, touching familiar surfaces, tracing decades of history, and reflecting on the preparation my wife had left for me. Each step reinforced my understanding that true power does not rely on aggression or confrontation, but on knowledge, observation, and careful timing. The daughter-in-law's assumed dominance was fragile, built on oversight and assumption, and I now held the complete picture of the estate's true protections. I retired to the study, placing the documents in a secure compartment, and allowed a quiet smile to cross my face. The first phase had been executed with precision observation. Patience and subtle positioning had secured the foundation for the reversal. The daughter-in-law believed she had won. She had not yet seen the depth of preparation and the layers of authority that were still hidden from her. The next phase would unfold with deliberate timing, and when it did, the shift would be absolute. Sitting by the window, I looked out at the darkened estate, the night calm and still. The daughter-in-law's confidence remained intact on the surface, yet beneath it the cracks were forming. Every misstep, every overreach, and every assumption she had made would be leveraged at the right moment. I had observed, recorded, and understood, and now the path forward was clear. Patience and preparation would guide the next moves, and the outcome would be decisive. The room was quiet, almost unnervingly, so as the meeting resumed, the daughter-in-law settled herself at the head of the table, her posture confident, her smile deliberate. She believed she had already won, that the estate, the accounts, and the decisions were firmly in her control. My son remained near her, uneasy, glancing at me with a hesitation he could not disguise. Martin sat beside me, alert, ready to intervene if necessary, but understanding that I would control the pace and the actions. I opened the first folder and reviewed the documents with a steady hand. The daughter-in-law began speaking, outlining what she assumed to be her authority, detailing the steps she intended to enforce. Each word she uttered was catalogued in my mind, every gesture noted, every inflection assessed. She had no idea that what she considered control was merely a surface layer, that the true structure of authority lay hidden in contingencies she had not discovered. I began signing the documents, each motion deliberate, slow, and precise. There was no hesitation, no visible resistance, only the appearance of compliance. She watched closely, her smile unwavering, interpreting my calm as surrender. But I was observing as carefully as she assumed I was defeated, noting every flicker of doubt in her eyes, every overconfidence, and every small misstep she made in asserting her dominance. My son shifted in his chair, restless, as though he could sense the discrepancy between her words and reality. He glanced at me, searching for clues, seeking reassurance, unsure how to act, without upsetting the delicate balance. I said nothing, allowing the tension to build, allowing him to observe the careful control I maintained. Observation, my wife had always taught me, was more powerful than argument, and the lesson had never been more relevant than now. The daughter-in-law continued confident, detailing the management of accounts, property, and finances. Every confident assertion was a thread in a tapestry she believed she had woven. But I saw the loose ends, the areas she had assumed were secure but were in fact carefully safeguarded. Each error, each assumption, each overreach was recorded in my mind, a map for the moment when action would finally be taken. I signed the next set of documents, noting the minor inconsistencies, the trivial misalignments in paperwork, the slight errors she had overlooked. Each signature was a calculated act, allowing her to feel in control, while I reinforced my understanding of her weaknesses. Martin watched attentively, knowing that my strategy relied not on confrontation, but on precision, patience, and subtle observation. The daughter-in-law's lawyer interjected briefly, asserting the validity of her client's claims. But I maintained my composure, letting the statement slide over me like water over stone. The room was charged with tension, yet I remained calm, deliberate, unshaken. Every gesture she made, every statement she issued only confirmed what I already knew. Her assumed victory was fragile, built on assumptions and overconfidence. I moved through the documents systematically, reviewing each line, each clause, ensuring that everything aligned with the contingencies my wife had embedded. The hidden accounts, the legal provisions, and the oversight of certain critical assets all remained within reach, untouched by her miscalculated claims. Each discovery reinforced the certainty that when the moment came, the reversal would be total and decisive. My son's unease grew as the meeting progressed. He began to notice the subtle discrepancies, the gaps in her confidence, the slight overstatements of control. He glanced at me with a mixture of curiosity and concern, beginning to understand that the appearance of compliance was masking a deeper, deliberate strategy. I offered him nothing but a calm, steady presence, allowing him to witness the power of observation and patience without forcing him to act prematurely. As the meeting drew to a close, I signed the final documents with the same deliberate care, letting the daughter-in-law believe she had secured her triumph. Her smile remained confident, triumphant even. But I noted the small cracks, the minor hesitations that betrayed overconfidence. Each was a subtle reminder that the appearance of dominance is easily constructed, but not always reliable. I gathered my folders and prepared to leave the room, moving slowly, deliberately, ensuring that my composure reinforced the illusion of compliance. The daughter-in-law had assumed victory, and I allowed her to believe it. Each word she spoke, each gesture she made, had been catalogued, analyzed, and noted. Every misstep she had made, every assumption she had clung to, had been preserved as leverage for the next phase of the plan. Once the meeting concluded, I walked through the halls of the estate, observing the minor adjustments she had made, the subtle shifts in decor, meant to signify dominance. Each was a mistake, a mark of overconfidence that had revealed her assumptions to me. I noted them carefully, preparing them for the moment they would be used to undermine her authority. The house itself seemed to echo the quiet patience I had cultivated, the careful observation that would turn her presumed victory into a hollow triumph. By late afternoon, I returned to the study, spreading out the documents I had reviewed over the past days. I organized them by priority, by leverage, by potential impact. Each note, each observation, each subtle inconsistency in her paperwork formed the foundation for the next phase. Timing, precision, and patience were critical. The daughter-in-law believed she had complete control, but in reality the map of power was mine, hidden beneath her assumptions and overconfidence. I considered the psychological dimension of the reversal I was preparing. The daughter-in-law would believe she had defeated me, that she had secured complete authority over the estate. My son's growing awareness, combined with my calm composure, would amplify the effect of the eventual revelation. Every minor action, every document signed under the guise of compliance had been a calculated step designed to position me for a decisive moment. As evening fell, I walked through the empty rooms once more, reflecting on the house's history, on the life my wife and I had built, and on the foresight she had provided. Every document, every instruction, every hidden safeguard was a testament to her meticulous planning. She had anticipated arrogance, manipulation, and impatience. The daughter-in-law had walked directly into the framework my wife had designed. I returned to the study one final time, closing the folders and placing them carefully in the hidden compartment. I allowed myself a small, quiet smile. The daughter-in-law may have believed she had taken everything, but the reality was far different. The first phase of the plan observation and preparation had been executed flawlessly. The foundation for the eventual reversal was complete, and all that remained was the careful timing of the next steps, the execution of the strategy that would restore the estate to its rightful order. I sat by the window, watching the twilight settle over the estate. The daughter-in-law's confidence remained intact, but the cracks were visible to anyone who looked carefully. Patience, observation, and preparation had brought me to this point. Every assumption she had made, every display of control had been catalogued and preserved for the moment when the reversal would be revealed. The night was calm, but I was ready. As I switched off the desk lamp and walked through the quiet halls, I reflected on the subtle power of restraint, on the advantage that comes from careful observation, and on the foresight that had been left to me. The daughter-in-law believed she had won, but she had underestimated what I had already uncovered and the patience I had cultivated. When the time came, the shift would be absolute, and the consequences undeniable. The stage had been set, and the moment of revelation was approaching. The room had a tense stillness that felt almost oppressive, as if everyone inside were holding their breath. The daughter-in-law sat at the head of the table, her posture perfect, her smile triumphant. She believed she had achieved total control, that her victory was indisputable. My son lingered beside her, shifting uneasily, and both lawyers were alert, waiting for any sign that might disrupt the delicate balance. I sat quietly observing, calculating, aware that the moment of truth was approaching. She began speaking, recounting her plans for the estate with confident authority, detailing her assumptions about the accounts, the properties, and the decisions she intended to make. Every word she uttered reinforced her perception of victory, and she looked at me expecting a sign of submission, a token of acknowledgement that her triumph was complete. But I gave her nothing, only calm, measured observation. My silence was deliberate, designed to heighten her sense of certainty, even as it concealed the full measure of my awareness. Martin leaned forward, slightly alert, but he did not need to speak. He understood that the timing had to be precise, that any premature intervention could ruin the strategic advantage we had cultivated. I continued to scan the room, noting every micro-expression, every flicker of doubt in the daughter-in-law's eyes, every subtle tension in my son's posture. Each observation confirmed what I had suspected. She had overestimated her control, and her confidence had made her blind to the layers of protection my wife had embedded. Then the moment came. Her lawyer, previously silent, lifted a document from the folder and began reading aloud. I leaned back slightly, letting the cadence of the words carry across the room. At first, nothing seemed unusual. It was a procedural statement, a legal notation. And then he read the line that shifted everything, a clause carefully drafted years before by my wife, granting me sole authority over a key trust and all associated accounts under conditions that had now been met. The daughter-in-law's smile faltered, almost imperceptibly, a flicker of recognition that something was amiss. She paused, eyes darting to the papers to Martin, then back at me. Her confidence wavered, though she attempted to mask it with a tight-lipped grin. My son froze, the tension in his body suddenly visible, as if he had just realized the true scope of the protections he had overlooked. The lawyers exchanged glances, surprised, recalculating their earlier certainty, dissolving in real time. I remained calm, seated, letting the reading of the line unfold. Every subtle sign of panic, every hesitation, every intake of breath from the daughter-in-law and her counsel reinforced the shift in control. She had assumed that appearances equaled authority, but the reality as revealed in that single sentence was far different. The power she believed she wielded had never truly been hers. The daughter-in-law's confidence broke further as the implications of the clause became clear. Certain accounts were now beyond her reach. Certain decisions required my explicit approval. Any attempt to act unilaterally would not only fail, but also expose her prior misrepresentations. Her overreach had created the very conditions that now solidified my authority. I observed her closely, noting the tightening of her hands, the slight narrowing of her eyes, the shallow exhalations that betrayed her frustration. My son's hesitation grew into comprehension. He shifted slightly, looking between us, realizing that the assumptions he had made about his wife's dominance were flawed. He began to understand that true authority was determined not by volume or bravado, but by foresight, preparation, and strategic patience. His posture straightened subtly, the tension in his hands easing as he absorbed the magnitude of the reversal taking place. I remained seated, calm and measured, allowing the full weight of the revelation to settle over the room. The daughter-in-law attempted to speak, to assert herself, but the words faltered. The foundation of her assumed power had been dismantled in an instant, exposed as fragile and ill-conceived. Every confident statement she had made earlier, every claim of dominance, was now undermined by the legal reality articulated in that single line. Martin gave a subtle nod, acknowledging the success of the strategy without breaking the calm of the room. I could feel the shift fully. The daughter-in-law's posture, her words, even her expression had changed. Where there had been certainty, there was now hesitation. Where there had been control, there was now doubt. The first phase of visible reversal was complete, and it had unfolded with precision, without confrontation, without haste, but with decisive impact. I rose slowly, gathering my documents, moving deliberately to reinforce the shift in power. The daughter-in-law looked at me, her smile gone, replaced by disbelief. She had expected compliance, perhaps even surrender. Instead, she found herself exposed, outmaneuvered, and unsure of how to respond. My calm demeanor, the deliberate patience of my actions, and the preparation that had gone unnoticed until now, created a psychological impact far greater than the legal reversal itself. My son finally spoke cautiously, carefully. His words were measured, reflecting his growing awareness of the situation. He questioned certain assumptions, gently challenging his wife's prior claims, and his voice carried the authority of someone who had begun to understand where true power lay. The daughter-in-law floundered, her attempts to regain control stymied by the revelation and the support of careful observation and legal clarity that now reinforced my position. The lawyers began the formal acknowledgement of the clause's effect, confirming the shift in authority and the invalidation of certain claims she had made. Every procedural step validated the strategic advantage I had cultivated, demonstrating the foresight of my wife's planning and the discipline with which I had observed, catalogued, and executed the first visible phase of our strategy. The daughter-in-law, now confronted with the full scope of her miscalculation, was silent, stunned, and unable to assert herself. As the meeting drew to a close, I felt a calm satisfaction. The reversal had been executed perfectly. No anger, no confrontation, only observation, patience, and precise timing. Every assumption she had made had been leveraged against her, and every misstep she had committed had created openings I could now use. The first tangible victory had been achieved. The balance of power had shifted, and the estate was no longer under her illusion of control. After the meeting, I walked through the empty halls of the estate, reflecting on the events that had just unfolded. The daughter-in-law's confidence had been shattered. My son's understanding of loyalty had begun to shift, and the layers of preparation my wife had left behind were finally revealing their purpose. I cataloged everything, mentally preparing for the next steps, knowing that the careful management of observation, timing, and leverage would continue to secure the estate and our family legacy. By nightfall, I returned to the study and reviewed the documents once more. The hidden accounts, the legal clauses, and the subtle observations of human behavior that had guided me through the day now formed a complete framework. Every detail, every misstep, every assumption had been accounted for, and the next phase of the plan could be executed with confidence. The daughter-in-law had underestimated the depth of preparation, the power of patience, and the consequences of overconfidence. Sitting by the window, I gazed out at the estate, the night calm and still. The shift in authority had taken place, and the reversal was complete in its first phase. The daughter-in-law would have to reconsider every assumption she had made, every display of confidence, every claim of dominance. Observation, patience, and precise execution had delivered a victory more powerful than confrontation ever could. In the silence of the night, I allowed a small smile to cross my face. The plan had unfolded exactly as intended. The first visible reversal was achieved, and the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. The daughter-in-law had assumed triumph, but the truth, guided by foresight and strategy, had proven far stronger. The stage was now set for the final consolidation, the moment when all remaining assumptions would crumble, and the estate's control would be fully restored to its rightful order. The morning after the final meeting, the estate felt different, though everything remained physically the same. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the familiar furniture, photographs, and trinkets that had witnessed decades of our family life. Yet the air carried a new energy, subtle but undeniable, a shift in balance, a quiet restoration of order that had been absent for weeks. I moved through the halls, slowly touching surfaces, running my hands over familiar edges and allowing the weight of what had occurred to settle. The daughter-in-law was no longer the commanding presence she had believed herself to be. Her confidence had evaporated, replaced by uncertainty, and the realization that she had overreached. My son was still uneasy, adjusting to the truth that his assumptions about her dominance were flawed. And as I observed them, I felt a quiet satisfaction, not from triumph or vengeance, but from the resolution of a carefully orchestrated plan, one that had unfolded without rashness, without confrontation, and yet with decisive impact. I returned to the study and reviewed the documents one last time. The hidden accounts, the legal clauses, the contingencies my wife had embedded, they all remained intact, now fully validated through the events of the previous day. The daughter-in-law's attempts to assert control had been anticipated, and every misstep she had made had been preserved as leverage. I allowed myself a moment to reflect on the scale of her overconfidence, how it had blinded her to the protections and foresight that had been quietly securing my authority all along. As I moved through the rooms, I reflected on the lessons this experience had revealed. Silence, patience, and observation had proven to be more powerful than confrontation. Every gesture, every hesitation, every overlooked document had become a tool in the larger strategy. My wife had always known this had prepared me not just legally, but psychologically to respond with clarity and precision. And now, seeing the results unfold, I understood fully the wisdom she had imparted. I paused in the living room, looking at the photographs of our family over the years. The memories of laughter, quiet evenings, and shared milestones filled me with a sense of continuity and legacy. My wife had ensured that this legacy was protected, and I had executed her plan flawlessly. The daughter-in-law had been shown the consequences of overconfidence and greed. But I had done so without malice, allowing the truth and the structure of careful planning to speak for themselves. My son approached, a tentative smile on his face. I understand now, he said quietly. I didn't see it before, but you had everything under control all along. I nodded, acknowledging both his words and the subtle shift in his perception. His loyalty, once clouded by manipulation and misplaced trust, was now aligning with reality. Observation and guidance, rather than force or argument, had helped him reach this understanding. The daughter-in-law remained silent, seated in the corner with a pale expression. She had realized finally that authority is not claimed through assertion alone. It is grounded in preparation, in foresight, and in the quiet strength to act strategically when the moment is right. Her overconfidence had led to her downfall, and the legal instruments my wife had embedded ensured that her influence was limited, controlled, and ultimately reversible. I walked through the estate one last time that evening, reviewing each space, each document, and each subtle adjustment that had been made over the past weeks. Everything aligned with the plan. The estate was secure, the assets protected, and the authority restored. The daughter-in-law's attempt at dominance had failed not through confrontation, but through precision, patience, and the careful execution of foresight that had been prepared long before she ever imagined claiming control. Sitting at my desk, I allowed myself to reflect on the broader lessons. Power is often misunderstood, particularly by those who equate confidence with control. True power, I had learned, is patience, observation, and the ability to act at precisely the right moment. My wife's planning had shown me this, and the reversal of the daughter-in-law's assumed triumph confirmed it. Knowledge, preparation, and strategic silence had proven stronger than arrogance or haste. The night settled over the estate, and I moved to the window looking out at the darkened grounds. The stars reflected in the quiet waters, each one a reminder of continuity and perspective. I felt a profound sense of closure, not only for the estate and the legal matters, but also for the emotional and psychological journey that had unfolded. The daughter-in-law had been confronted not with anger, but with the certainty that comes from careful planning, observation, and the subtle application of leverage. As I turned from the window and sat back in the study, I considered what I wanted to share with others who might one day find themselves underestimated or confronted by greed, manipulation, or arrogance. Sometimes the most effective response is not immediate confrontation, but deliberate patience, careful observation, and the strategic use of knowledge and preparation. Strength is not always loud, and victory is not always immediate. I looked at the camera as if addressing anyone listening and spoke quietly, deliberately. If you have ever been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed, remember that patience and preparation are often more powerful than anger. Observe carefully, plan deliberately, and act with precision. The advantage is in the unseen, the overlooked, and the quietly prepared. I continued, have you ever faced someone who assumed victory before it was theirs to claim? Share your experiences in the comments below. Tell us how patience, observation, or strategy has helped you regain control in your own life. And if you want to hear more stories of quiet triumph and family drama, subscribe to the channel, because there are more lessons to be learned and more strategies to uncover. Leaning back, I reflected on the journey. The daughter-in-law had assumed she controlled everything, but she had not anticipated foresight, preparation, or the subtle observation that had guided me. My son had begun to understand where real authority lay, and the estate was secure legally and ethically. The plan my wife had embedded had unfolded perfectly, and the reversal was complete. I allowed myself a final moment of satisfaction. The house, the legacy, and the family history were intact, protected, and restored. The events that had unfolded demonstrated the power of patience, observation, and strategic planning. And while the daughter-in-law had been humbled, the true lesson was not vengeance, but mastery, the careful execution of knowledge and foresight. As I closed the ledger and walked slowly through the halls, one last time I felt a sense of peace, clarity, and quiet triumph. The estate, the legacy, and the principles my wife had instilled were secure. The balance of power had been restored, and the lessons of patience, observation, and preparation were evident in every detail. I looked out the window once more, the stars reflecting the calm of a night secured through foresight and strategy. And I spoke softly to anyone willing to listen. Strength is quiet. Power is patience. Victory comes to those who understand the unseen, the overlooked, and the carefully prepared. Learn, observe, and act wisely, and you will always hold the advantage.